In the early 8th century, when the remnants of the Western world were still struggling to rise from the ashes of Rome, a new and powerful force swept across the horizon. It came from the deserts of Arabia, carried by men who rode with remarkable speed and discipline, united under a new faith and a rapidly growing empire. Islam under the Umayyad Caliphate. Their armies, hardened by decades of warfare, seemed unstoppable. They crossed North Africa with astonishing speed, conquering ancient territories one after another until they reached the Atlantic coast. Then, in 711, they crossed the narrow strait into Europe, crushing the Visigothic kingdom of Iberia and establishing Al-Andalus. For the first time in history, the Islamic world touched the very edge of Western Europe, and it did so with overwhelming force. Within a few short years, the Umayyads pushed farther north. By the 720s, their raids crossed the Pyrenees, penetrating deep into Gaul. Towns were sacked, local rulers defeated, and Christian territories shaken to their core. Europe, fragmented and politically unstable, seemed unable to mount a unified resistance. Yet, in the heart of the Frankish lands, a single man began to rise above all others. He was not a king, yet kings bowed before him. His authority grew from sheer military brilliance and an iron will. His name was Charles Martel, the man who would later be remembered as the Hammer of the Franks. Charles was the mayor of the palace, theoretically a servant of the Merovingian kings, but in reality, the true power behind the Frankish realm. His life had been shaped by war, civil wars, tribal rebellions, and external threats. Battle by battle, victory by victory, he forged a centralized and loyal power base. The Frankish nobles followed him not merely out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. They saw in him a commander whose strategies were sharp, whose discipline was unmatched, and whose determination was unshakable. When news arrived that the Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, was marching north with a powerful expeditionary force, Charles understood instantly that the fate of the entire continent might rest on his decisions. Abd al-Rahman's army, made up largely of swift and deadly cavalry, swept into Aquitaine with dramatic force. Bordeaux was overrun, and Duke Odo of Aquitaine suffered a devastating defeat. Unable to resist alone, Odo, who had once been Charles's rival, rode north in a desperate plea for help. Rivalry no longer mattered. If Aquitaine fell, the path into the heartlands of the Franks would lie open. Charles agreed to join forces, not out of friendship, but because he knew that he stood at the last barrier between the advancing Umayyad armies and the vulnerable kingdoms of Europe. Charles mustered his forces carefully. His army lacked the elegant speed of the Muslim cavalry. Instead, it relied on heavy infantry, men with thick armor, large shields, and unbreakable discipline. They were not the fastest troops on the battlefield, but they were among the most steadfast. These Frankish warriors knew they were defending not just land or political power, but their homes, their families, and the very heart of their faith. The two armies finally halted between the cities of Tours and Poitiers. The terrain was hilly and forested, a perfect choice for Charles, who needed to neutralize the mobility of Abd al-Rahman's cavalry. He drew his troops into a dense, immovable formation, a living fortress reminiscent of the ancient Greek phalanx. Shield touched shield, spear overlapped spear, and every man stood shoulder to shoulder as if they had been carved from a single block of stone. For a full week, the armies watched each other from across the battlefield. Skirmishes broke out at the edges, testing reactions and defenses, but neither side wished to commit to a full engagement too soon. Tension stretched across the plains like a drawn bowstring. Then, at last, Abd al-Rahman commanded the charge. The sound of the Umayyad cavalry roared like thunder as thousands of hooves struck the earth. They charged with tremendous speed, their lances aimed at the center of the Frankish line. Normally, such a charge would shatter infantry formations, but when the wave of horsemen crashed into Charles's ranks, the Frankish phalanx held firm. Shields locked in place absorbed the shock. Spears braced forward created a deadly forest of steel. Again and again, the cavalry returned, regrouping and launching fresh assaults. The ground shook under each attack, yet the Frankish line did not break. Those watching from the hills might have marveled at the sight. A wall of men gripping their weapons with white knuckles, refusing to take even a single step backward. The Muslim cavalry, accustomed to breaking weaker enemies with brute force and speed, found themselves halted again and again by this stubborn, disciplined infantry. The sun dipped low and rose again as the two armies clashed in relentless fury. Still, the Franks endured. As the day wore on, the ferocity of the Umayyad charges began to take its toll. Weapons splintered, shields cracked, and men on both sides fell beneath the weight of steel and exhaustion. Though Charles's infantry still held firm, he knew that no formation could withstand such relentless pressure indefinitely. His men were strong and disciplined, but they were human, and the constant pounding of enemy cavalry threatened to break even the toughest ranks. Some shields were little more than shattered planks now, spears bent from repeated impacts. Charles, watching from behind the lines, understood that if something did not change soon, the wall he had built with such care might finally collapse. To preserve the formation, he began rotating his troops. The most battered and exhausted warriors withdrew to the rear, while fresher but less experienced soldiers stepped forward to replace them. It was a dangerous decision. These frontline replacements lacked the veteran toughness of the older fighters, and Abd al-Rahman noticed the shift immediately. Sensing weakness, he ordered his infantry to advance. They rushed forward not with the speed of cavalry, but with determination to exploit any gaps in the Frankish line. This was the moment Charles had feared, the moment when the steadiness of his shield wall would be put to its greatest test. Yet the younger Frankish soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder, did not falter. The presence of Charles Martel himself, looming behind them like an anchor of iron, gave them courage. They had held the line for hours. They would hold it still. Many fought not because they expected to live, but because they were unwilling to be the one who let the line break. Every step backward would bring their enemy deeper into their homeland. Every moment of wavering would invite disaster. So they planted their feet and stood as the waves of battle crashed upon them. Even so, Charles knew that resolve alone would not win the day. The battlefield had become a grinding stalemate, one in which the side that adapted first would prevail. It was then that Duke Odo of Aquitaine proposed a bold plan. Instead of continuing to absorb the endless hammering of Umayyad forces, why not strike at their heart? Their camp lay behind the main lines, lightly protected, filled with the wealth they had seized from Aquitaine. Gold, supplies, and the precious goods that gave the Umayyad warriors pride and purpose. If the Frankish cavalry could reach it, even briefly, they might shatter the morale of the entire Muslim army. It was a desperate gamble, but Charles agreed. Under the cover of chaos, Odo led a small contingent of cavalry in a sweeping arc around the battlefield. Dust rose behind them as they slipped unnoticed past the raging conflict and descended upon the Umayyad camp. What they found there was a poorly guarded treasure trove, and without hesitation, they attacked. Flames rose, Shouts erupted, and word spread like wildfire across the battlefield. The Frankish riders were plundering the Umayyad baggage train. This news struck the Umayyad ranks like an arrow to the heart. Many of the Muslim warriors had fought across continents, collecting wealth that symbolized not only victory, but divine favor. To lose it was unthinkable. Confusion rippled through the ranks as men wavered between continuing the fight or turning back to protect their camp. Abd al-Rahman, realizing the danger of panic, ordered his soldiers to pull back and regroup. What had been a coordinated assault now threatened to dissolve into chaos. Seeing the enemy falter, Charles seized the moment. He ordered a full counterattack. The Frankish infantry surged forward with renewed strength, pushing toward the camp where the Umayyads were struggling to reorganize. Steel clashed against steel as both armies converged on the same ground, creating a whirlwind of violence. In the midst of this brutal melee, something happened that would change the course of the battle entirely. Abd al-Rahman himself, mounted and rallying his troops, was struck by a projectile, perhaps a spear or an arrow, and fell from his horse. His death was immediate, and though his men did not yet know it, the heart of the Umayyad command had been cut out. For a time, the fighting continued as fiercely as before. The Muslim soldiers fought with courage even without knowing their leader lay dead among them. In some areas, they even pushed the Franks back. The battlefield raged with uncertainty, each side both exhausted and determined, neither able to fully seize control in the fading light of day. Charles realized his men were nearing their limit. If he pushed them further now, they might break from exhaustion before victory could be secured. Instead, he ordered them to withdraw in good order to their own camp. The final blow, he decided, would come with the dawn. But when dawn arrived, the field before him was silent. The Umayyad camp, once full of life and movement, now lay abandoned. Sometime during the night, upon discovering Abd al-Rahman's death and fearing renewed Frankish assault, the Muslim army had made the decision to withdraw completely. They left behind tents, supplies, and even a portion of their hard-won treasure, anything that might slow their retreat. They had not left as conquerors, but as survivors seeking to escape a trap they no longer believed they could break. For Charles Martel and his exhausted army, the meaning was clear. The battle was over, and they had won. Not through superior numbers or greater speed, but through discipline, strategy, and resilience. This victory would echo through the centuries, reshaping the future of Europe and establishing Charles not merely as a military leader, but as a guardian of the Western world. When the Franks stepped cautiously into the abandoned Umayyad camp, the silence felt unreal. Only hours earlier, this ground had trembled under the hooves of war horses and echoed with the cries of men locked in desperate combat. Now, the morning air carried only the faint smoke from smoldering campfires and the eerie stillness that follows a storm. Tents stood partly collapsed, supplies lay scattered, and the vast baggage train, once the pride of the Umayyad warriors, was left behind in haste. It was as if an entire army had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but the ghosts of its ambitions. Charles Martel walked among the remnants with the hardened gaze of a man who understood war better than anyone alive. He saw the abandoned weapons, the overturned chests, the footprints leading southward. He knew perfectly well that the Umayyads had not withdrawn out of kindness or weakness, but out of necessity. Their leader was dead, their lines disrupted, their confidence shaken. But even in retreat, they remained dangerous, and Charles, ever cautious, chose not to pursue them. His men, battered and weary, needed rest more than glory. A reckless chase could have turned triumph into disaster. The Frankish soldiers, though exhausted, felt a growing realization settle upon them. They had done what no army in Western Europe had done before. They had stood against the might of the Umayyad cavalry and survived. Some looked at the piles of abandoned treasure with disbelief. Others knelt to pray. A few simply stared at the horizon, still expecting a counterattack that would never come. Victory, when it finally arrived, felt strangely quiet. As the news spread across Gaul, a wave of relief washed through the land. For decades, the Umayyads had moved like an unstoppable tide, sweeping across continents, conquering kingdoms, reshaping cultures. Many believed that nothing could halt their advance. But here, between Tours and Poitiers, on a field none had considered sacred before, something remarkable had happened. The tide had been stopped. In the months that followed, the battle became more than a military victory. It became a symbol, a message whispered throughout Europe, that the forces threatening Christendom were not invincible, that unity and discipline could overcome even the most formidable foe. Charles Martel's reputation grew immensely. Though he never claimed the title of king, the kings themselves now ruled in his shadow. Nobles sought his favor, warriors pledged their loyalty, and the church looked to him as the protector of the faith. But Charles, practical as ever, did not revel in fame. He understood that a single battle, no matter how glorious, did not guarantee long-term security. The Umayyads still held Iberia with strength, and their raids into southern Gaul would continue for years. The victory at Tours had stopped their northern expansion, but the struggle for dominance in the region was far from over. For Charles, the battle was not the end. It was the beginning of a new phase of preparation. He spent the following years reorganizing his military, reinforcing borders, and consolidating the power that would one day allow his lineage to reshape Europe entirely. Far beyond the Frankish realm, however, the meaning of the battle took on a life of its own. Chroniclers in later centuries would portray it as the moment Christendom was saved, the moment Europe's future identity, cultural, religious, and political, was preserved. Some historians would caution against exaggeration, reminding that the Umayyads never intended to conquer all of Europe in one swift campaign. Yet, even these modern voices admitted that something profound had indeed taken place. The northern frontier had held, the invincible had been challenged, and a new confidence had taken root in the peoples of the West. For the Umayyads, the retreat was a bitter but pragmatic decision. Without Abd al-Rahman's leadership, cohesion had evaporated. The losses they suffered, combined with the long distance from their power centers in Iberia, forced them to rethink their ambitions beyond the Pyrenees. They continued to raid southern Gaul, but never again would they launch an invasion deep into Frankish territory. The psychological barrier forged by the Battle of Tours would endure for generations. Charles Martel, meanwhile, returned to his halls not as a mere commander, but as a figure of destiny. Many of his men began to call him the Hammer, not only because of his strength in battle, but because he had struck a blow that echoed across the world. He shaped the foundation upon which his son, Pepin the Short, and later his grandson, Charlemagne, would build an empire that would redefine the medieval West. On quiet evenings, long after the battle, one might imagine Charles standing upon a hill overlooking his lands. Perhaps he reflected on how close Europe had come to a very different future. Perhaps he thought of the countless men who had held the shield wall beside him, men who would never return to their villages or families. Victory always carried its cost. but he must also have understood that he had altered the course of history. The world after Tours was not the same as the world before it. Where once there had been fear and uncertainty, there now existed hope, and the belief that Europe could survive the storms that sought to engulf it. The hammer had struck, and the reverberations would shape centuries. In the years that followed the Battle of Tours, stories of the conflict began to travel far beyond the borders of the Frankish lands. What had once been a brutal clash between two armies gradually transformed into something larger, an event wrapped in legend, reshaped by memory, and magnified by the hopes and fears of generations. Word spread through monasteries, across market towns, and along the dusty roads of pilgrims. Many who had never seen the battlefield came to speak of it as if they had stood upon the very ground where the fate of Christendom had been decided. Some accounts spoke of Charles Martel as if he were chosen by heaven itself, a man raised up in the darkest hour to preserve the West from an unstoppable tide. Others imagined the Frankish shield wall as a miraculously unbroken line, held firm by divine hands. Even the Umayyad cavalry, whose speed and precision once struck terror into the hearts of Europe, became part of a growing myth. They were no longer just soldiers, but the embodiment of a vast empire stretching endlessly from the sands of Arabia to the fields of Gaul. And yet, despite the embellishments, a core truth remained. Something extraordinary had indeed happened on that distant autumn field. But while legends grew, Charles himself remained grounded in the realities of power. He understood that victory at Tours had given him prestige, but prestige alone could not build a lasting legacy. The Frankish kingdom was still fragile, bound together by shifting loyalties and the will of its nobles. If he wished to shape the destiny of the West, he had to strengthen the foundations of his world. He reorganized the military, ensuring that the disciplined infantry who had held the line against the Umayyads would become the backbone of future Frankish strength. He forged alliances, subdued rivals, and extended his authority over rebellious territories. Each step, each decision, quietly prepared the way for a new age. Beyond the Pyrenees, the Umayyad world also shifted. The defeat at Tours, though not catastrophic, echoed with quiet implications. It reminded their leaders that the lands north of the mountains were not easily conquered, that distance and logistics could wear down even the finest armies. Internal pressures grew within the caliphate. Rebellions, rivalries, and administrative strains that stretched across its immense territory. The dream of pushing deeper into Gaul faded, replaced by the ongoing need to maintain control within Iberia itself. Yet even diminished ambitions could not erase the powerful impression the Umayyad forces had made upon Europe. Their cultural influence continued to flow northward. Their knowledge of mathematics, science, architecture, and agriculture would, in time, help shape the intellectual rebirth of the continent. The battle had halted expansion, but not the exchange of ideas, a quiet irony that only history would fully appreciate. As decades passed, Charles Martel's children and grandchildren inherited a world transformed by his victories. Pepin the Short, his son, would eventually become king with the blessing of the Church, a groundbreaking departure from tradition that would elevate the prestige of the Frankish throne. And Pepin's son, the legendary Charlemagne, would rise to become one of the most influential rulers in European history, carving out an empire that spanned vast swaths of the continent. Scholars would later argue that none of this would have been possible without the solid foundation laid by Charles Martel, nor without the confidence earned on the field between Tours and Poitiers. But even as the Carolingian Empire flourished, the memory of the Umayyad threat remained alive in the stories passed from one generation to the next. Monks wrote of Tours not merely as a battle, but as a salvation. Chronicles spoke of a moment when Europe had stood at a crossroads, with the future of its religion, language, and culture hanging by a thread. These tellings grew more dramatic with each retelling, and Charles's figure grew taller, his deeds bolder, until he became less a man of flesh and blood and more a symbol, a defender of a civilization on the brink. Still, if one could travel back to that quiet morning after the battle, when Charles surveyed the abandoned camp and the broken field, one might see a very different image from the myth that would form centuries later. There were no grand speeches, no triumphant celebrations. There was only exhaustion, the muted weight of survival, and the knowledge that battles do not end simply because the fighting stops. Charles understood that the true struggle, the shaping of a stable and enduring world, had only just begun. And yet, whether he intended it or not, his victory became a turning point. It marked the moment when Europe realized it could stand firm against forces greater than itself. It became the spark that would ignite confidence in kingdoms long accustomed to turmoil. It offered a glimpse of future unity, however distant that unity might be. And in the quiet spaces between the lines of every chronicle, one senses the same unspoken realization that history itself had paused on that field, taken a breath, and changed direction. As the centuries unfolded, the memory of the Battle of Tours did not fade. Instead, it grew roots that stretched deep into the cultural imagination of Europe. What had been a clash of armies began to take on symbolic meaning, shaped by storytellers, monks, rulers, and later, historians who searched for turning points in the long and winding path of civilization. Each generation found something different within that distant struggle: fear, triumph, identity, warning, pride. And so the story transformed, evolving with the people who retold it. In medieval halls lit by flickering torches, bards spoke of Charles Martel as a warrior blessed by heaven, the man whose hammer struck down the forces of darkness. To knights setting out on pilgrimage or war, the battle became an example of unwavering courage, of a shield wall that no terror could break. To the Church, it became proof that divine favor could manifest through human hands when faith was threatened. And in the minds of kings who dreamed of unity, Tours became the moment when the fractious tribes of Europe caught their first glimpse of shared destiny. Yet the deeper legacy of the battle was not merely military or religious, it was psychological. Before Tours, Europe had often seen itself as the fractured heir of a fallen Rome, vulnerable and disorganized, overshadowed by the grandeur and progress of civilizations to the east and south. But after Tours, a quiet confidence began to take shape. The Franks had not just survived. They had held the line against one of the most formidable armies of the age. This sense of possibility would nourish political ambition, cultural renewal, and the slow formation of what would one day be called the European identity. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the significance of Tours was interpreted differently. For the Umayyads, it was not a catastrophic defeat, but an encounter at the edge of an immense frontier, a costly raid that had simply reached its natural limit. Their empire, stretched across 3 continents, faced internal challenges more pressing than the distant lands north of the Pyrenees. Revolts, rival dynasties, and administrative burdens were rising, and within a generation, the Umayyad Caliphate itself would be uprooted by the Abbasids. The withdrawal from Gaul became just one thread in a much larger story of transformation. But even if Tours did not shake the Islamic world as profoundly as it shaped Europe, it still echoed in subtle ways. It signaled the boundary of expansion, a reminder that geography, logistics, and local resistance could halt even the mightiest of empires. It reshaped Andalusian strategy, pushing rulers there to fortify their strongholds, deepen cultural development, and turn more of their energies inward. In an unintended way, the halt of northward expansion helped ensure that Islamic Iberia would grow into a beacon of learning, a crossroads where Arabic, Jewish, and Christian scholars exchanged knowledge that would eventually spark Europe's intellectual awakening. Back in the Frankish world, Charles Martel's legacy began to intertwine with the rise of the Carolingian dynasty. His reforms reshaped Europe's military structure, establishing a system in which land was granted in exchange for military service, a system that would later be recognized as one of the foundations of medieval feudalism. His consolidation of power allowed his son Pepin to claim the crown and his grandson Charlemagne to forge an empire that would inspire the political imagination of Europe for 1,000 years. And yet, despite the towering figures who followed him, Charles Martel remained the quiet architect behind it all. He had never sought royal titles, never built monuments to himself, never carved his triumphs into stone. The battlefield where he earned his greatest victory would not bear his name. His legend would be left to others to mold. But perhaps that was fitting, for the story of Tours itself was not one of spectacle. It was one of endurance, strategy, and the hard, unsung labor of holding the line when all else threatened to collapse. As time passed, the story traveled further. Renaissance scholars rediscovered the chronicles and wove new interpretations. Enlightenment thinkers debated the significance of the battle, some calling it one of the most important in world history, others urging caution against exaggeration. Modern historians would later sift through the layers of myth, acknowledging both the limits of the battle's immediate impact and the enormous weight of its symbolic afterlife. And still, the fascination remained, for Tours occupies a place not only in military history, but in the collective memory of the West. On quiet nights in the Loire Valley, where the winds still move through the same forests that once concealed the Frankish shield wall, one might imagine the echoes of that long-ago struggle. The clatter of hooves, the cries of warriors, the steady drum of shields held firm against all odds. The land remembers, even when the world forgets. And in that memory, Charles Martel's victory endures, not as a simple triumph of one people over another, but as a moment when history pivoted, when possibility shifted, when the shape of things to come was altered by the resolve of men who refused to break.